Back to English 2602 tutorials. This will be our first video tutorial. Previously, we were introduced to the idea of discourse analysis that is relevant to this module. Now that you've all begun to grapple with the idea of how to look at words and their implied meaning in sentences, I thought we could look at a passage from a larger body of work. Please pause here and go and find your 501 study guide. Turn to page 3 and 4 and then reread those concepts. Once done, come back and we will begin our analysis. I have taken an excerpt, so a short passage, from Alice in Wonderland for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's out of copyright, so I can't get into trouble for using it. And my source is Gutenberg, which is an online website that gives access to thousands of out of copyright manuscripts, stories, poems. So I've used that. Then it is a story that most people have at least heard of in some way. This is the opening paragraph, and it has no real context because we're only just beginning the story. Okay. In an exam, you will get an excerpt from anywhere in a novel that your lecturer has chosen, and you will need to engage in analysis. So I'm going to read the excerpt. You will probably need to use the PowerPoint that is attached to this tutorial and keep this excerpt with you as we go through so that you can do your own work. I will read this excerpt to you now. Alice was beginning to get very tired of sitting by her sister on the bank and of having nothing to do. Once or twice she had peeped into the book her sister was reading, but it had no pictures or conversation in it. And what is the use of a book, thought Alice, without pictures or conversation? Now, one of the first elements that you've been asked to consider is subject matter. What is this text about? Because this is a short excerpt, it has very little information, but we can pull out some content, and we can use that for what we could colloquially call a bare bones analysis. Okay, so at the moment, we know that it's a bored little girl. She has nothing to do. She takes a peek every now and then at her sister's book because she's bored and she's hoping for some kind of entertainment. And then she's annoyed because there aren't any pictures in the book. And so the book is boring to her. Okay. So what I want you to do is, once this tutorial is over, I will give you a task where I will ask you to go and pull out particular words that you can use to prove that Alice is bored and that she's got nothing to do. All right. This is a fictional work. You will, in this module, be given two different genres, main genres, nonfiction and fiction. The nonfiction focuses mostly on persuasive texts, so you will have two types of persuasive texts, and then the fiction, you have prose, which this is an example of, you will have poetry, and you will have dramatic works. Okay, so the example here is something that you can use for all of your fictional works, but it is some of the elements aren't relevant to fictional works, and I have made a note of where you should be looking or how you should be using these concepts for nonfiction rather than fiction. We will get to that as we go through the different genres. Okay. Now, Who is the speaker? Who is the writer? Is another concept in your study guide. In this paragraph, we hear Alice's thoughts, but they're not first person. Alice herself isn't speaking. We are seeing her thoughts through what we call a narrator, the person who's telling the story. This narrator is third person, and because it's another person who has the ability to see inside Alice's mind and describe what her thoughts are, her feelings, we call that third speaker omniscient, because they're all-knowing. And therefore, we can generally trust what they are, their statements, their observations about the characters, about the actions. If it were first person, we could be more wary because obviously it's subjective. Okay, so that's really the emphasis for the narrator, for the perspective of the narrator. Is it first person, second person, third person? Okay. It is different for a fictional work versus a non-fiction work. A non-fiction work is generally created with the intent that the author is talking directly to the audience with a purpose in mind to convince them to buy something, to buy into an idea, to buy a product. Here, that's not the case. Okay, so it's more fictional based, and so we're not going to really focus so much on the speaker, on the writer. What we can focus on is Alice's thoughts and what those thoughts suggest about her. She's very young. She doesn't read. Okay, she likes pictures. So she's quite immature, and she is more easily entertained by those visual elements. Okay, so we could also say that she's got a short attention span, but that's mostly what we can say. Then, the audience. This idea again focuses predominantly within non-fiction texts. Try not to engage with what the audience is meant to do or see, or the effect that the text has on the audience, mostly because you don't get the entire text. You invariably get an extract. And so it is difficult from an extract to talk about intent, purpose, and effect. So rather focus on more close analysis and read the question very carefully. Still, we could potentially make an argument, but it would be based on my knowledge and your knowledge of the text as a whole. So again, an extract, not the best place to talk about audience and intent. Alice in Wonderland is a child story. We could make that argument based on what we've read already. Okay. If you had read the entire text, and if you were being asked about the entire text, you could also talk about how it's a political satire, and therefore it is a valid text for adults. Okay. But as I've noted here, it isn't an aspect of our analysis that would work well for fictional texts, especially for your close extract reading. It is much more effective for our non-fiction elements. The source. Once more, sources are more relevant when we're looking at non-fictional texts, because if I have a newspaper article printed in a highly respected investigative journalist newspaper, it's more than likely going to have certain expectations that come along with that newspaper organization. So I would expect them to have facts. I would expect them to be detailed. Most news organizations have a political leaning. Either they are for a political party, for a political ideology, or against. And so we could then start anticipating how their arguments are going to be shaped and what biases they're going to have. for literature, for poetry, for your dramatic works, the sources are very difficult to really engage in, and as such, I suggest you don't actually use or discuss the source when you are providing your analysis. Okay. This is because invariably it's going to be written again. You're going to be looking at it in an extract. Okay. You're going to be asked a very specific question in terms of analyzing the passage and analyzing the text. And when it was published, what country it was published in, and the repeated publications of the text are basically irrelevant to the purpose of this module. Okay. This context is vitally important. This is where we are going to get most of the information from, and we're going to unpack the significance of the information from our passage, from our poem, from our dramatic work. Context is also exceptionally important in our non-fiction texts. I will be giving a post specifically on context in the next week or so, so keep an eye out on that. So for here again, we have a very short paragraph. It's just an opening paragraph, but it does give us some information about Alice, where she is, what's happening, and obviously as the novel is read, more detail comes to light and more context comes to light. So at the moment, we have a little bit of setting. She is down by the river. She is bored. She is doing nothing. Her sister is busy reading. So that suggests that there's a certain sense of calmness, that they're both supposed to be passing the time quietly, enjoying the day. Okay. And so we have those elements that give us some context. What's happening? Where is it happening? Why is it happening? If we can get to the why. Here, we can't really get to the why, but again, that's because it is a short passage. Purpose is another aspect that you've been asked to look at. Once again, purpose is something that predominantly is focused on the non-fiction text. Okay, we could be asked, what is the purpose of a particular idea? What is the author trying to show by focusing on a particular idea? Okay, so we could look at purpose in that way. Mostly purpose is used for non-fiction. Okay, so keep that in mind. For fictional works, most novels are here to entertain. If you identify particular themes can link to purpose. Okay, so if I am looking at, for example, Pan-African writers, generally they write about a post-colonial world. They try to reject the colonist arguments that are presented in or colonial works, and so it tries to sort of celebrate African authenticity. So with that kind of theme, we can generate a sense of purpose. This extract here is too short for that. Okay, but sometimes and oftentimes in the exams, in the assignments, you will have enough content to focus on a specific theme, and that you can engage with here. Okay. Finally, tone. Tone, like context, is important. Tone gives you a sense of what the author is feeling. So include with tone, attitude. What is the attitude of the writer? What is the attitude of the character? So, for example, Alice is annoyed. She's frustrated because she's got nothing to do. She's bored at her sister's book. The fact that there's no pictures in the book, that also shows irritation. Okay, so we can look at these kinds of elements, and the tone will then inform on attitude. Tone is the tone of voice, how people speak. Now, of course, within literature, you're busy reading, so it's a lot more difficult to imagine the person's tone, but then we start looking at specific words. We look at the words, we look at how they're used, we look at the connotations. And from that, then we start thinking about connecting it to a tone, connecting it to an attitude, connecting it to a mood, connecting it to an atmosphere. So these are certain elements that we should look at when we are busy analyzing a passage. Finally, style. Now, I've given you two pictures here to indicate style, kind of like a very light-hearted style and a very serious style, both interpretations of Alice in Wonderland. But really, when we talk about style, it's something that most schools teach in high school level. Is it objective? Is it subjective? So again, the more non-fictional works will focus on objective content, whereas the more fictional works will focus on subjective. Now, be careful about that, because in non-fiction works, if it is a persuasive text, then they may give factual evidence, they may give detail that swings into the objective content, but there's always going to be some kind of subjectivity, because the author is trying to convince you to agree with what they are saying. Okay, so keep that in mind. It's not always objective. It's just that we're going to see more objectivity within the non-fiction texts, whereas in the fiction texts, it's going to be informal because we're following a story. There's going to be imagery, there's going to be contractions, there's going to be all sorts of things that show informal, register, colloquial, subjective style. Okay, so keep that in mind. It often doesn't really have a lot of factual relevance to our analysis, but it's always good to keep in mind. Okay, so here with Alice in Wonderland, with this passage, she is definitely subjective. Her implication that books are boring when they don't have pictures is subjective. Her sister's very happily reading the book, so her opinions are subjective. So you could argue that point, but then you would need to link it to something else. So here is just a very, very, very brief overview of how you could potentially engage with these elements. My suggestion is that you understand what they are, you understand how to identify them, but be cautious about what genres focus on what elements and prioritize what elements, because that changes. And oftentimes this unit 1 is a quick unit, we brush over it, it can help you, but another warning that I want to give you is try not to have a paragraph on style, have a paragraph on context, have a paragraph on tone. That doesn't work. We will be looking at how to write essays, how to engage with essay writing. So keep an eye out for that as well. I hope this has at least given you something to think about in terms of the different elements that Unit 1 is asking you to focus on. Again, this module is a lot more about writing technique and analytical skills. These concepts, these 8 concepts, are here to help you, to guide you, but they should not be your core focus in this module. Okay, I will see you in the next tutorial. Bye.